Escaping Denver, Batch 5. Interview with author Teague Bohlen. And welcome back to Batch 5 of Escaping Denver. We are kicking off the season with a special episode this year. I am Mike Howorun, co-creator and writer of Escaping Denver, and this morning I get to sit down here with Teague Bohlen, author of the upcoming Escaping Denver novel. Now, I have it on good authority that Escaping Denver is made in a closet in East Vancouver, so how does a professor from Denver get looped in with these guys?
I think I was just lucky. I was assigned to write an article about Escaping Denver because I work for a publication called Westward here in Denver. We're an alt weekly, and I basically do anything that's nerd related for them. I also dabble in politics here and there, but mainly I stick with my one true love, which is anything related to the world of geeks, joyous geeks. And so they told me, hey, these guys are doing this podcast. It's set in Denver. Why don't you get a hold of them? And so I found you guys and got to talk with you about the podcast. And I remember thinking the first time I heard about it, I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. This is like, it's one of those ideas that's like head smacking, especially if you live in Denver and you were around like I was for the advent of DIA when it was built after the closure of Stapleton Airport and all the mythos that grew around DIA. That's so much a part of Denver sort of culture. The idea to take it into the sort of conspiratorial and cryptid angle narratively was just so cool. I was so jealous. I'd actually gotten to interview you guys twice, and then it was just one of those things I think that happens a lot in the arts in general. I had a former student of mine, David Slayton, who is writing still for Blackstone, and he had sort of posted somewhere, I don't remember where, but that they were looking for someone for a writing project. And I almost didn't follow up on it, but I pinged him and I was just like, what's going on with this? And he put me in touch with Brendan Deneen at Blackstone. And I sent him some of my stuff. I've written a couple of books before and sent him some of my stuff. And he was like, hey, let's give it a shot. So it was just one of those weird, series of open doors that meant to be,
Definitely meant to be. It's serendipitous that the person who's authoring the very first Escaping Denver novel also, thankfully, was familiar with the podcast and the story behind it.
Yeah, and a fan of the podcast. Like when there's so much to it that feeds that excited comic book reading, in search of watching kid that I was growing up. It was exciting to be able to be a part of it and to just discover new elements of our world's mystery to sort of put into this new narrative world. Now,
I guess for the people listening, they might be thinking, well, what is the Escaping Denver novel? Is it just a novelization of the podcast? Is it a retelling of the journey of Noah and Sarah? What can you say about it without giving too much away?
Yeah, it was a fascinating concept, which is one of the reasons that I was so excited about it. It isn't a novelization of the podcast. The podcast, I think, is sort of its own beautiful little artifact. And I think wisely, what I was being asked to do was to sort of create a parallel narrative in the same world. So it's a shared world, sort of shared universe concept, but it's not the same story at all. It's just a story that fits into that world that's informed to some degree by Noah and Sarah and all that they experience. The characters in the book are aware of the podcast. And so they are inspired by the podcast to go and sort of do their own search, their own investigation. And that's sort of where it all kicks off. So it's a whole new cast of characters, but the same kind of world in which Noah and Sarah had to sort of wander for a while. One of the really fun parts, anyway, of writing the novel was getting to include like, oh, I remember that. Let's put that in. And then at the same time, sort of creating this new mythology. There are sort of new things that I hope this book gives birth to that have a life much longer than I will. To just mysteries that we sort of are bringing to the table, making up sort of out of whole cloth, admittedly, but that you're like, well, that's possible. That's possible.
Well, it's coming up with these justifications to tie in different conspiracy theories and cryptids. And,
exactly.
Speaking of the fan base of Escaping Denver, we have some wonderful artists that have made some incredible fan depictions of characters. And I can guarantee the book is filled with characters you're going to want to draw. You're going to want to figure out what they look like, new creatures. It is exciting and different. And I love the fact that the story is being told in a different medium. When I think about the gang behind Escaping Denver, it's a lot of varied interests, nerds. We love conspiracy theories and superheroes, but we also love radio plays and mythology and history. And speaking for myself, it is, my interests are time-stamped in the 80s. Now, there's a vibe in your writing that does feel very 80s fun, if I can say that.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think it goes back to that old sort of, there's a rule in comic books. I think that comic books were the best when you were 12. Whenever that was, that's when comic books were the best, right? And so I kind of feel the same way about nerd culture, but maybe a little bit later, like when you were 17, like that's when all of those different sort of mythos sort of cemented themselves within your brain. And yeah, for me, I'm definitely going back 80s, plucking certain things from maybe even the late 70s and reaching into the 90s too. But that's definitely where my brain goes in terms of reference, for sure. It was Stranger Things influence, but maybe even taken further, because I think they kind of abandoned the 80s stuff after a while on that property. But yeah, we're going whole hog on Escaping Denver.
80s felt like a time, at least in cinema. I can't speak to the books of that era because I'm not as literate as I would like to be. But the movies and television, there was a lot of fun, right? The fun got to be part of the process of character self-discovery. The adventure got to be fun. It wasn't just action-packed. There was a not necessarily a silliness, but an opportunity for fun. The Goonies.
Yes.
It's Indiana Jones for kids, sure, but what it really was a fun adventure with people, with a misfit cast.
Yes, yeah. The misfit cast was big. I think Star Wars back in 77, I think sort of kicked off this cultural desire for greater character development in their sort of fantasy, action, adventure, sci-fi sort of stuff. Before that, you had these archetypes, which weren't bad, but they weren't all that well developed. Flash Gordon, for example, great character, but not all that well developed. I don't know that much about Flash Gordon's childhood, for example. What made Flash Gordon? I don't know. We pick him up as a football hero in college, and from there we just move forward. We don't actually look back. So I think characters were becoming really important in the genre in the 80s. And you're right. I think there was this sense of fun. There was this sense of joy, even when there was just horrible things happening on the screen. There was a sort of a delight to it, especially for the audience, if not for the characters living through it.
Yeah, absolutely. 80s is forever going to be my touchstone. I think I learned about archetypes from John Hughes, and I learned about how to challenge those archetypes from the same man.
Yeah.
And yeah. I think that's something you've done in this book quite nicely, is that some of these characters maybe start as archetypes and evolve, and you kind of show the the stepping stones of here's what our expectation is, and here's what, the reality of what people are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Again, I cannot speak. Having been a person who's read the book a couple of times now, it's a lot of fun and exciting to expand the universe inside and outside of the facility. Expand the universe in terms of creatures and characters and lore. You got to dive a lot deeper into some of these seeds that had been planted along the way. That we need different mediums to be able to sow and to tell those stories.
For sure. Yeah. That's the really exciting thing, is that this novel, not to get too much ahead of ourselves, but the novel really seems like the first part of a much larger story to be told, which is exciting. There's a lot of promise to it. There are a lot of threads, even though I think the book has a definitive sense of closure to it. It also leaves a lot of threads that I think readers are going to say, hey, what about this? Like this, there's more to this. And there sure is. There's a lot more to it. So there's more to explore.
Well, the podcast features, Noah and Sarah, victims of circumstance. They start at a deficit, but there is a semblance, or at least a feeling of control behind your characters in the novel. These are characters taking the bull by the horns. They're making a choice. And that differs. That kind of changes the vibe entirely.
It does. It does very much, because not only are they they have more agency as characters. They have put themselves in this position very purposefully. They have sought it out. They have sought people to help them get into this situation. And so, there's a certain grim reality to it when they get into the middle of it, into the soup, really, deep, that they also know that they got themselves here. And so there's this almost sense of resigned responsibility to some degree with the characters, where they're like, well, okay, now we just have to get out. The agenda shifts from, hey, what's this all about? I want answers, to, hey, I just want to survive and get out of here, and go back home, even though I don't know that once you've stepped into that river, I don't know that you can step out. Yeah,
it's not a place you can dip a toe into. No. And it's there's nothing more dangerous than getting exactly what you want. And I think you find that with the characters in their books. But let's take a moment outside the book, outside of Escaping Denver, and talk about. Oh, it was going to sound very serious for a moment, because I almost just said your beliefs. But let's talk about your beliefs. Let's talk about the whimsical world of cryptids and science fiction and aliens and conspiracy theory, and what your relationship is with that.
Okay. All right. For me, I think it has to go all the way back to, well, really two things. One, of course, is Star Wars in 1977. I was 7, almost 8 when Star Wars came out, and which means that I was absolutely the right age to just buy into that for the rest of my life. Like anybody that was in that range at all, from 77 to 83, if you were a kid in that period, it was very likely that Star Wars had a pretty large impact on your life. So that was probably my genesis. And then from there, for sure, moved into comic books. I was gifted a box of comic books by my uncle at one point when I was about 5 or 6, and tore through all of those comic books, sometimes literally. I had no respect for comic books back in the day, the sanctity of them anyway. But I read them voraciously, and then eventually started to keep them and collect them and all that good stuff. So comic books stuck around for a very long time. I still buy comics to support the medium, not as much as I used to, but still do. I still follow it. I've passed that on to my children as well. And then when I was a teenager, started playing Dungeons and Dragons and other sort of tabletop games that sparked these ideas of fantasy narrative. And I have a great group of friends that I've known since we were all 15. And we still get together in person once or twice a year to play the same campaign of Dungeons and Dragons that we've been playing since the mid '90s. So long time. I know.
I had a campaign going for 3 years that I was very proud of, that we were able to do 3 years. But
that's an accomplishment.
No, you brought up a big thing about comic books, and I can see how. For me, I was a voracious reader, but I read fantasy novels as a kid. I didn't read sci-fi. The only sci-fi I digested was in the form of movies and television.
Yeah.
For me, I read mostly fantasy, but comic books were the first time that I saw that comic books got to pluck from other mediums. With Alpha Team in Canada, they had Sasquatch. And I'd only ever thought of Sasquatch as you have a tinfoil hat and you believe this giant ape man is running around, or it feels kind of like lore. But I never thought about plucking that kind of thing and pulling it into another world and having it make sense. And I think that's, that occurred in the podcast. Just Bigfoot or Sasquatch exists and it has a role to play. We said from the get-go, it's Escaping Denver exists in a world where, all the conspiracy theories are true, just not for the reasons you believe. And that's, there's always more to it. And we're only ever given a half story, and that's why we dismiss it. And I think comic books were a great medium for being able to pull all these different things together and have it make sense and feel, again, like you had permission to make a new thing out of these old parts.
Absolutely. And that's so much a part of why comic books, I think, still survive today. With the Marvel comic universe that was so huge 10 years ago, I think borrowed on that sort of, Marvel might not have invented the shared universe concept, but it definitely worked it the hardest. And that idea of all these different stories happening in similar locations that sometimes cross over, that mention each other, that was not only genius marketing, and it was genius marketing, but it was also like supremely satisfying for a reader, like to feel like they were being able to witness something that's putting all these pieces together. The puzzle comes together for the reader in a way, in the comic book world anyway, in a way that hadn't been available previously.
And so the novel just expanded upon and allows for, more opportunities to dive into new things and new creatures and we start to figure out how the facility runs a little bit. In your side, you get to tell a very different story than the podcast, which is limited to the audio sphere. I would love to show visuals of what the biodome caverns look like, or some of these grand spaces, and we try our best to illustrate that with sound. But in the novel, you're going to get to dive in a way that I think the audience is going to really love biting into this world and having it painted a little bit more for them.
Yeah, that's the benefit of the narrative form, right? I mean, like one of the things I always loved about radio drama was how creative they had to get with sound effects and with characters describing something obliquely in a way that might not be completely normal, but we buy it because of the way that it was written. It's just the sort of benefit of the different form, but it was a great opportunity to sort of explore. I remember contacting you guys several times about like, what does this actually look like? and to get a better sense of the space, because it was important to do it justice for all of the fellow fans who were, of the podcast, to not all of a sudden reinvent something and say, oh, that was completely wrong. This is actually what it is. It all has to maintain continuity.
Yeah, and from our end, we appreciated that. We spent a lot of time, in creating this world, or at least defining it in our minds. And, as creators, it is very difficult sometimes to remember what you've told the audience and what you actually already know about things.
Yeah.
And so that, we have our Bible about the world, but it's tricky to remember exactly what information the audience has, because at the end of the day, the world does have rules. It does seem boundless, but there are rules. There's things that do tie things together. There is a history behind the collective and what is going on inside this universe. It just feels like an endless sandbox, but there is and are connective tissues and rules and boundaries that are maybe invisible to the listener, but that's great. And it was a privilege from our end to see the world expanded through somebody else's mind and seeing how they view the world.
I was thrilled to be able to do it. Just there's such an immense, the podcast offered such a great starting block in terms of, because you're right, it's a very, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but it's a claustrophobic sort of sense, and I think purposefully so, right? Like Noah and Sarah are trapped in these spaces and they want to get out. But the book allowed me, and I think the storyline, the world, the shared universe, to really, really sort of bust out of its own box to some degree, and to really just sort of explore this world in a way that it's super exciting. It was a lot of fun to just say, hey, can I throw this in? Yes, I can.
It is a ragtag group, your cast of characters, but for the most part, it is a female-led story.
It is. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I grew up, like I said, only older sisters, very strong, incredible older sisters I respect and I'm terrified of equally.
As it should be.
As it should be. And so when you were crafting her, did you pull from, or do you feel like you were inspired from any strong or female characters from other medias?
Oh, what a good question. You know, there was no specific person that I patterned her or really any of the characters on specifically, but there's definitely elements of a lot of different heroic female figures. I think that there's definitely a little bit of Sarah Connor. There's a little bit of Ripley from Alien in there. But I really wanted it to be, I wanted her to be at her core. I wanted her to feel unfinished in a way, right? Like she is in this, when the book starts, she's in her early 20s. She's kind of searching for her place in the world. And that's one of the reasons she goes about doing what she does in the book, taking that leap. But the idea of this heroic figure being not only strong and more capable than she realizes, perhaps, but also vulnerable in a lot of ways and unsure about what she's doing. There's a lot of self-doubt in her, at least early on in the story, and I think that is a propulsive element for her as a character to sort of not only rescue herself, but also rescue these friends that she's found and feels responsible for putting in this spot to some degree, and then making sure they all get home.
I think, the thing we love about heroes is watching them find that courage, find that heroism. It's less exciting if they show up already as the badass superhero. Harkens back to what I said about we want to see ourselves and we want to connect. Yeah. And I think, we know in our heart of hearts, we're not all John McClane from Die Hard 3. At best, we're Die Hard 1 John McClane, which is still great, but it's still in the path of discovery. It's not starting as this impenetrable superhero, and nor is that interesting because I don't think any of us can relate to that. Or if you can, congratulations that you get to walk through the world feeling that way. But I certainly don't. And, I like to see my characters in media reflect my apprehension, if not my anxiety.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, one of the genius things you mentioned Die Hard, and I've talked to my students about that movie, and I think the genius parts of that first movie were really due to how human they wrote him as a character. He was doing some super heroic things, but there's a price that you pay for these heroics, I think, is one of the things that definitely is a part of Escaping Denver. it's it you know the podcast and the novel both, I think, strive to present these fantastic situations, but in a way that makes sense and that I think has this realistic sense to it, that maybe this is happening right now. And that's part of the charm.
It should cast doubt, right? Because I think what you've done in the novel and what has been accomplished in the podcast is just showing another perspective on some of these conspiracy theories that, yes, in and of themselves, they are there's some lunacy to them, but are they any more ridiculous than the conspiracy theory themselves? You know, it's if you're choosing to believe any, you kind of have to choose to believe all. And that's the idea, is that we weren't trying to reinvent the wheel. We were just trying to take it from a different angle where you, as the audience, get to say to yourself, maybe actually. Yeah. You know, maybe. Yeah. Question things, and wanting to question things is kind of the big takeaway from all of this, is that we should be questioning everything. And I think that both of them accomplish that. Yeah.
No, I think so. I think that's the sort of X-Files sort of influence in terms of stories like these, where you have these characters who believe, right? And because there's default belief and then there's default skepticism, and neither one is probably the right way to go. There's a healthy mix of both that we need to go into this and to solve mysteries in a real way. But yeah, one of the things that was fantastic about writing the novel was just sort of grabbing onto these real world mysteries that sometimes we don't even go into in the book in any major way. They're there sort of as Easter eggs for people who know a lot about conspiracy theories and like bizarre little factoids about mysteries that we've experienced in the world that are unexplained. And we're able to set it there and say, hey, if you want to discover this, here is this buried treasure for you. And it's that was fun, I think, to sort of lay in some of that stuff that isn't having a huge and active role in the narrative, but they're there as little gifts for the readers, I think.
It's like I enjoy everyday magic. You know, this trend of putting little doors in front of trees, those little elf doors. Anyone who's ever put eyes on a tree, I love it. Keep doing it. I think discovering magic in the world is exciting. And if we can reframe the world through the stories of Escaping Denver, in that you might see that magic or see something a little differently moving forward, I think it's a win. I think if we can connect Sasquatch to aliens to New Coke to, if we can connect all of these pieces and have it all make sense, it allows us to kind of see the world from a new lens, and hopefully, a little bit more of that found magic that can exist. The belief that all of this is, if this is happening, it's all happening right under our noses.
That's the gift, right? That's like the dream, I think, of any fantasy, science fiction, speculative fiction kind of, is that, you come away from it with this greater sense of what's possible in the world and what, like you said, might be right below the surface. I remember when I was 13 and I was really into reading old 60s Conan the Barbarian paperbacks that I would get at used bookstores. And I remember one of them, I don't remember the name of the book, but it started off with it was an essay essentially that somebody had written. I'm going to murder this, but it was basically like, it was a academic treatise on the historical Conan that somebody had written about where Conan actually lived in world history and what these different lands represented. And I remember thinking, well, wait a minute. For just for a little bit, my 13-year-old brain was like, is Conan the Barbarian historical? Is this just like, okay, okay, that's cool. That's even cooler than I thought the world was, actually.
It's you want them to be real. And, I definitely believe we all have fears, and we want to define those fears. And it's easier to call my fear of darkness my fear of the boogeyman, because it's easier to give it a name. And I think that, we've had hundreds to thousands of years of evolution and telling these stories and trying to explain our fears and justify our fears, that we create this wonderful wealth of lore.
Absolutely.
We're all just trying to justify that feeling in the pit of our stomach. And in doing so, sometimes you say, it wasn't just a bear. It was a giant man, huge, 6.5 feet tall, swinging arms. I wasn't just scared of a bear. It was different. It was different for me. And I think that, we have a history of that. I think that humans have always wanted to do that. And I think because of that, there's this wealth of half-truths that we have to dig through and figure out.
I totally agree. And it also gives, I think it's throughout the years, the centuries, the millennia, it's given human beings a sense of power over the fear as well, because there's always rules that come with that. Like if you're afraid of the dark, there's no rule that can help you, right? That it's just you're afraid of what's out there. You're afraid that you're not alone in that darkness and that something is threatening you. But if there's a boogeyman that is within that darkness, there's always a rule, like the boogeyman will come and get you therefore, if I don't do those things, then I am safe from the boogeyman. Or that's why there are rules about vampires. There are rules there. Every monster has its rules to it. And makes it a little more knowable. And therefore lets us quell the fear a little bit and give us agency over it. And it's sort of a great side effect that it also creates fantastic narrative.
Yeah, and thankfully Escaping Denver is the world of nameless creatures sometimes, because we don't know these new fears. And we're creating new fears as we go along. I mean, the Mongolian deathworm alone scared the begonias out of me, and still does. It's the creature that has stuck with me in the cryptid world, because it's
that's your big fear in there.
Well, you start dipping a toe. I have basic conspiracy theory and cryptid knowledge, social osmosis version. I know Loch Ness. I know the Mothman.
Yeah.
But to actually dive into some of these, and the line between cryptid and mythology and lore gets blurred super quickly. And, you start to see parallels across the world of, shapeshifters and half animal creatures. And you start to think, well, why is everyone coming up with these animal human hybrids? It's either that they're all trying to justify the same fear, or there's a human animal hybrid globally. Right. It's either or. And so you start to play that game in your head about how do we justify these things. And like you said, you want to name it so you can know the rules of how to beat it. But the more you dig into these cryptids, you realize you don't know any of these things. These are all fears you didn't know you had. And things that, I have plenty of reasons to be afraid of the dark. I didn't need more. Same with I studied invertebrate zoology in university, and microorganisms made water terrifying to me. I'm still pretty scared of water in general, because the evidence of how much life is in it. And so I guess removing the curtain and knowing more sometimes just increases that fear.
That's true. That is true. It's also, I think, for me, I think you mentioned, that you connected with the Mongolian deathworm in a sort of way. I found myself most creeped out, I think, by the suggestion of the mermaids in the canals in the podcast, because previously, I think the traditional idea of mermaids is more like Ariel from Disney, and but the idea that they would be sort of these aquatic, like hag creatures that, it was not only just terrifying to me, but also disappointing in a way that the world often lets you down. Like, oh, this is this isn't the romantic idea of this beautiful maiden fish person, which is weird enough, but she's actually quite terrifying and will, eat your face. And that's, yeah.
It's the embellishment of the lonely sailor. Again, humans creating stories to justify their feelings. And, the idea that, no, the mermaid was actually beautiful. No, what I'm feeling is normal. It was a very beautiful mermaid and not this monstrous fish hag. But we're all just trying to write our own narrative and justify our feelings. is there a takeaway for this book? If you've never listened to the podcast and for whatever reason this is your first episode, again, congratulations. If this is your first episode, bold way to start listening to us. Please go back and listen to the podcast itself. It's got a great narrative and it'll help tell the story. But for new listeners, you're brand new, they don't know the world of Escaping Denver, what is their takeaway for this book?
Okay. Yeah. I think the first thing that pops to mind, honestly, is that we all created this so that the two would stand alone. I think the podcast and the novel would be able to stand alone in a way that, so if somebody was coming fresh to the world of Escaping Denver through the novel, they wouldn't be confused, and vice versa, right? You don't have to read the book to understand the podcast. You don't have to listen to the podcast to read the book, but you should do both things because it's an additive, right? They build off of each other, and there's a lot more to get. So I think the takeaway ultimately, if someone's coming at the book fresh, I think it's a fantastic invitation to the podcast to look at that as like an extension of what they've already experienced in the novel. Whereas most of the fans of the podcast are going to have the opposite sort of experience in sort of looking at the novel in terms of a fresh look at something that they already know and love. So there's that, I think, that additive sense. But I think there's also the other takeaway that occurs to me is that, like I said earlier, there's so much more to explore. That now that Escaping Denver has embraced the sort of world at large, we're out of the confines of Escaping Denver, the collective's center of operations, even though we keep going back. But there's so much more to tell. There's so much more story to tell. There's so much more weirdness out there. It's like the flip side of the old X-Files line that the truth is out there. The weirdness is out there too. It's all just waiting for discovery, and sort of hiding in the shadow with gnashy, terrible teeth.
It feels like a nice entry into the world of conspiracy theories and mythos in a fun way that doesn't take itself too seriously, though the situations may be dire. How the material is handled is with care and a lot of fun. And I do think it's a safe entry point for anyone who's wanting to know a little bit more about conspiracy theories or how they could play out in a narrative and what this world is, and start to question things, what the world at large, your world, is doing, and start to question some of those truths. Now, the book comes out August 5th.
August 5th is the launch date. Yep.
So you can pre-order now at Blackstone Publishing. Yes, Amazon. But also, if you're interested in this, go to your local bookstore. Let them know this is a book you want. Get it on your shelves. I'm very excited about the growth of the world of Escaping Denver and the growth of our Escaping Denver family with Teague Bohlen. I only additive, like he said, it's additive. He has only been additive to this group, and I'm very excited about how you all are going to devour this novel. I think it's a lot of fun.
I'm happy to have joined our own little collective.
Yes, our own little collective. Somehow we were the villains all along. All right, so thank you to Teague for being with us. Go get out there, get the book. Go to your library, let them know. If you don't want to buy it, let your library know you want it. Get them to take it. Let's get this book out there. And as always, I'll be back next week with another episode of Escaping Denver.